Okay, good morning. I'm Ralf Dickel. I'm Senior Visiting Research Fellow at the Oxford Institute of Energy Study. Many thanks for the opportunity to present parts of my paper ET29, which stands for Energy Transition 29, and is about decarbonizing Germany's heating sector. Next slide, please. Yeah, so in Germany, we have a Climate Protection Act, which is derived from the IPCC report on 1.5 degrees Celsius. And this was following a ruling of our Constitutional Court, Bundesverfassungsgericht, of April 2021 on the original Climate Protection Act, which was somewhat unprecise and not very stringent. And the Constitutional Court then followed the IPCC report insofar that it said, okay, 1.5 degrees Celsius corresponds to keeping with carbon dioxide budget, a limited carbon dioxide budget of 570 gigaton. And Germany cannot claim more than its share in the global population, which is circa 1%. So the original CPA was disadvantage future generations by having two not stringent enough provisions on saving carbon dioxide, and that would lead to younger generations having to make up all the stress in 10 years maybe. So basically it ruled that the Climate Protection Act as it was not constitutional, at least not in part, and that led then to an amendment of the Climate Protection Act, which included more stringent limits and also binding net zero for 2045. Now, the Climate Protection Act itself is neutral on the possible technicalities, how to achieve this net zero. So it could be by saving, by carbon dioxide-free energy like renewables, could be by fossil fuel with CCS, and last but not least, also with direct air capture, also that is really very much into the future. And it was also neutral on the ways of implementation, whether that is by standards or by PIGU taxes or by, let's say, subsidizing, like we see it in the Inflation Reduction Act in the United States, or by cap and trade, which is basically the EU methodology. Next slide, please. Now, what out of that context is for policy making and what is for regulation? Now, the starting point is really a question about global public good and externalities, which is addressed by the nationally determined contributions under the Paris Agreement. And for Germany, we have the Climate Protection Act, which is much more stringent, namely net zero by 2045. And that means that time is really of the essence. I mean, this is just 20 years left from now. So major points are for policy making, namely the technology approach and also the instruments how to cover externalities. And the externalities is on one side kind of saving the climate, and on the other side, it's also still reliability of energy supply. Most decarbonization technologies require some kind of a grid and some infrastructure, and that then brings it into the realm also of regulators. But when it comes to the question what infrastructure is needed, that is more a policy question. For example, if you want to have a nationwide hydrogen grid, or what kind of carbon dioxide collection system you want to have, and what infrastructure should be regulated, what infrastructure should be left to market forces, is also to policymakers. I mean, there could be elements like carbon dioxide collection systems, which are contestable, so they may or may not be left to regulation. And then you have the question of coordination between the many infrastructures. That's also, first of all, a policy question, but then also a question for regulators. And then the regulation of the specific infrastructure is clearly for regulators. There's a bit of a pitfall in all of that questions because there are so many and they're overlapping. And the question is if, so to speak, everything is covered and what a responsibility is not just shifted between, let's say, policymakers and regulators. An example for that is what we call Dunkelflaute. Dunkelflaute is a period when you have low wind and little sun. And that means you have very little renewable power fed into the grid. Now, that is a situation for which the grid is always fit. I mean, there's no problem to handle very low electricity grid feed in. But then this is something where eventually politicians say, okay, the grid is fit to handle Dunkelflaute, but then they forget to discuss the question, where would electricity come from during a Dunkelflaute? And the regulator would eventually say, okay, I have to implement policy targets which are clearly defined for the electricity system, and otherwise that's up to the TSOs to deal with it. So there's a question which somehow falls in between the chairs. That's a bit of a risk in all of that setup. Next slide, please. Now talking about heat in Germany. Heating is about 60% of final energy supply in Germany. That means if you succeed to decarbonize the heating sector, then that's already half of what you have to do, at least. And another 30% of final energy is from traffic. So traffic and heating together make 90% of final energy. And if you decarbonize that, then you're almost there. Heat itself is different, whether it's for industry or whether it's for residential and commercial. In industry, usually it's above 100 degrees Celsius. There's very little space heating in industry, but most of it is process heating, which requires other measures than space heating. In residential and commercial, we have some 95% share in the residential sector of final energy, and in the commercial sector, some 62%. So again, here heating is a major part of final energy consumption. In the heating sector, in residential and commercial, the heating requirement is very much influenced by ambient temperature. On one side, it's low temperature, I mean, it's below 100 degrees Celsius. But on the other hand, it's depending on ambient temperature. When ambient temperature is low, then heating demand is high. The other point is that it's spread point sources of carbon dioxide, and that means you cannot hope to decarbonize these sources of heating. I mean, you can decarbonize a large power plant, you can eventually decarbonize a large chemical plant, but you cannot decarbonize single household burners. That means that the final energy has to come to the burner in a form that it does not emit carbon dioxide. That means for gas especially that gas as a final energy will come to an end, especially in household and commercial. But gas as a primary energy, that is eventually different, because you may still need enough primary energy, which we will not get out of the renewables as they are rolled out. Next slide, please. That is kind of the classic curve of temperature dependence of space heating from the gas industry. That does not include the oil industry, because for that you don't have enough data. But the temperature dependence is very linear. Basically, per degree of temperature, then you have a certain amount extra when temperature drops. And that changes over time due to better insulation, eventually due to more renewables. But the fact that you have a linear dependence is unchanged, also with changing parameters on settlement structure, housing structure, and so on. Next slide, please. Now here you have a comparison between the monthly capacity demand by the power sector, which is the lower part of the graph, and the monthly demand for gas, which is the upper part of the graph. And you see that in winter times, the demand for gas, and that is mainly due to the heating requirements, is about 3 times the demand for electricity. Of course, that is then a demand of energy in thermal energy, because electricity is of course demand for electricity energy, so that makes a bit of a difference. But when you want to replace all of the gas heated demand, and on top of it, of course, all the demand which is covered by oil heating, by electricity, you see what kind of a very, very, very challenging task that would be. And you would also see that kind of for electricity, you have a relative steady usage of the power grid, but for gas, it's a very strong winter-summer ratio, And that is something that you would also have to manage by the electricity grid if you would go for an all-electric, all-heat pump solution. And again, on top, the oil-heated buildings. Next slide, please. When you look at heat pumps, then in Germany, we have now about roughly 2 million heat pumps, and more than half are heat pumps which are air-to-water heat pumps, meaning that they absorb heat from the ambient air, and then water is heated and that heats your home. In contrast to heat pumps which can absorb heat from a constant temperature, like the deep drilling heat pumps or heat pumps which are kind of buried types which have a constant temperature of maybe 40 degrees Celsius or more. There you're not so much dependent on ambient temperature, but for air to water heat pumps, you are dependent on ambient temperature. And that creates a dilemma that when the ambient temperature drops, then on one side your heating demand increases, but on the other side, the efficiency of the heat pump goes down to an extent that you come to the point of bivalence where you then have to add electric heating. So while you save a lot by heat pumps, also by air to water heat pumps, when it's getting really cold, then you have a capacity problem, an electricity capacity problem, because then not only the demand increases in line with the falling temperature, but also the efficiency of the heat pump drops in line with the ambient temperature. That's then a real capacity problem for the electricity grid. Next slide, please. So to illustrate a bit the size of heat demand, in the right-hand graph, what you see on the left column is the composition of seasonal storage as we have it now for heating. So basically, you have storages in gas storage, which is about 280 terawatt hours, and then just a bit arbitrary here, 80 terawatt hours for oil tanks in 6 million houses and 6 million buildings are added. So you end up with 360 terawatt hour thermal, and that was at times also just enough. We had a cold, long stretched out winter. I think it was in 2017. And then at the end of that winter, on the gas side, we had to draw on the cushion gas in the gas storages, which is something you would usually not do. But it was, so to speak, just enough. So the 360 terawatt hours were really needed to cover the heat. Now, when you would switch, let's say, to hydrogen, then first of all, you would have to replace the 80 terawatt hours of oil storage. Nobody knows how that would work. And when you look on the gas storage, you have about 120 terawatt hours of gas storage in porous storages, which are not suited so far, at least for hydrogen. And then you look on the about 180 terawatt hours capacity you have in salt caverns, when you would fill them with hydrogen instead of with methane, then their capacity would shrink to about 1/3 to 52 terawatt hours. So that is what you would get out if you would convert the existing storage system to hydrogen. And if you would then wish to go for an all-electric system, then out of this 52 terawatt hour, you would only get 21 terawatt hours electric. So that is on one side, and on the other side, you could of course say, okay, yes, with heat pumps and with better insulation, maybe we save half of the storage for winter, which is a very, very ambitious assumption. And after that, we save also 1/3 because we use heat pumps, which have an average efficiency of 1 to 3. And so you end up with extra electricity needed of 60 terawatt hour electric. So that is about 3 times more than you could provide with the existing storage system when switched to hydrogen. When you look on potential electricity storage, as it is, for example, shown in the network development plannings that we have, then you end up with 320 gigawatt hour. That means that is a factor of 50 between what you need and what you could provide by electricity. So that brings me to the conclusion that an all-electric system, as it is foreseen, for example, in the network planning for 2037, 45, that will not work. I mean, the network development plan for 2037, 2045 foresees a switch in Germany of heating to 15 million, extra 50 million heat pumps and the corresponding electricity system, and this all renewable. This is not possible. Now let's look at the heating of buildings. What is the status and what options would we have to decarbonize heating at the heating point and also to decarbonize the energy supplied to the heating point. When we look at the status in 2019, that was the latest large assessment of our building structure, and buildings built after that were usually net zero or very low energy buildings. So that's a good reference point. And at that time, we had 19 million buildings in Germany. Buildings, not apartments, but buildings. Out of that, 9.5 million were gas heated and 6 million were oil heated. So most of the 6 million are on the countryside, about 5 million are on the countryside, which have no alternative access to grid like district heating or gas. And 1 million is more in the suburbs, which would have an alternative to be linked to district heating or to gas heating. So this is basically the 15 million buildings which have to be changed to net zero heating. On the other hand, we have a gas distribution grid. It's a grid on the local level, it's a low pressure grid of 550,000 kilometers. And we have district heating grids in total of 33,000 kilometers. So all of that would have to be replaced by heat pumps. Now, according to the latest network development plan and according also to the prevalent thinking of our government. So that, as I mentioned, would not work for 15 million buildings based on all renewable energy supply, because there's not enough seasonal storage. There are power grid bottlenecks between north and south, which to overcome would cost more than 100 billion euro. This rollout of renewables is too slow, even under the optimistic government program. And also the rollout of heat pumps, 15 million in 20 years, is also probably extremely challenging, maybe not for the manufacturing of them, but for the installation of them. Alternatively, you could think of 15 million heat pumps with local fossil power with CCS. So you would only have local bottlenecks in power to address, which is already the problem now. You would still have a limited rollout speed of heat pumps, basically due to installation of them. You would have an unnecessary high power capacity to back up the heat pumps, and you would waste possibilities of cogeneration and the use of carbon dioxide-free sources for district heating. So in my paper, I suggest that the best thing is probably to have an almost equal split between the three possible carbon dioxide-free heatings, namely heat pumps, district heating, and switching from methane to hydrogen. So that would mean to expand the district heating system by 4 to 5 million buildings linked to the district heating in high energy areas, mainly in the city centers and surrounding. And you would certainly go for a must connect policy. This would require a doubling or tripling of district heating grids, which is very ambitious, but still looks feasible. And for the rest, you would use whatever is needed from 550,000 kilometers of gas grid to switch it to hydrogen, which looks possible. There was a testing of all the plastic and steel, which is used for the pipelines in the distribution grids, and 95% of the length is hydrogen ready. So that should be feasible, provided you have enough hydrogen. So the next point, when you have on one side decarbonize the points where the heating is taking place, the next point is to provide these heating points with decarbonized energy. Now, for heat pumps, you would have to have CO2-free power. I mean, we have now a share of almost 50% or around 50% of renewables in our power generation mix, but there's still 50% which is fossil. And so you would have to increase the share of renewable, and you would still have to have some backup power from fossil fuels, then with carbon capture and storage. For the district heating systems, there are a lot of possibilities to feed in carbon dioxide-free energy. One thing which exists in Germany, in the south, is geothermal, quite a potential. And that is also a national energy, so that's good. You would also use large heat pumps, let's say in the order of 100 megawatt thermal. There are a few projects under construction, and that could use wastewater or river water or eventually lakes. You could eventually also go for standardization of these heat pumps to save money. You could use waste from decarbonized industrial heat, which is also starting to happen. And you could use combined heat and power with CCS. Because the demand for power in heat pumps and the demand for heat is basically in sync. So there's a certain parallelity. And so you would use the fossil fuels that you use and the decarbonization part of it to full extent. And the third point is then switch from methane to hydrogen. Again, it's possible on the distribution level without much additions. The problem is where would you get carbon dioxide-free hydrogen from? So this could be green hydrogen. Now, this will take some time until we really have enough surplus renewable electricity to create enough green hydrogen. So in order to meet the target in 2045, one has to take a recourse to blue hydrogen from autothermal reformers with CCS. In all three options, basically you need carbon capture and storage, and in all three options you would need carbon dioxide collection system. Now, such a carbon, and that means you should start early on to get this going by 2045. Now, such a system is something which may or may not be regulated. You could transport carbon dioxide also by ships via the rivers, which is a perfect viable option. And on the other hand, also carbon dioxide does not really need a grid. It's just a collection system. But there's no meshed grid that you need, really. You transport it to the north of Germany, where you either give it to the Norwegians to sequester it, or under the new discussions that we have, maybe you could also sequester it in the exclusive economic zone of Germany. On the other hand, also carbon dioxide pipelines by capacity are smaller than the overall market. So it may be not in the beginning, at least, a case for regulation, but eventually for free market. And then when you come to a stage where you have to include smaller producers of carbon dioxide, maybe one could switch to a regulated system. But that is open and that is up to policymakers. Next slide, please. The next. Oh yeah, sorry, I'm one slide behind. Next slide, please. Could you bring on the next slide? Okay. Here in this slide, it's shown what is the status of readiness of different steps in kind of a decarbonization strategy for the heating sector. And you see that one of the difficult parts with regard to renewable electricity is a storage question. I mean, you will not have batteries which are large enough to bridge more than maybe a week. Certainly not seasonal demand. And when you go away via a hydrogen storage, I mean, you have electrolysis, and then you have hydrogen, and then you have a hydrogen system, and you would use hydrogen storage, the salt caverns in the north of Germany. then this would not be enough, and you can leach new salt caverns, and there's enough of salt domes in the north of Germany. But the leaching is really a bottleneck, because leaching is restricted in order not to increase too much the salt concentration in the water, even not in the seawater. So that is certainly a bottleneck. And so far, what we have done, or what we see, is some first caverns which are switched from methane to hydrogen on a pilot basis. I know about 4 of them. So that is a bottleneck in the rollout of renewable, and using renewable to cover seasonal demand. Also, the other ways have some of their challenges, and one of the challenges is certainly when you want to decarbonize power production. One way is you go via hydrogen, then you have hydrogen-ready turbines. So far, there's one which is in operation, at least to my knowledge. Last year in autumn, there was a 15 megawatt hydrogen-ready, 100% hydrogen-ready turbine linked to the grid. So that looks also like still a long way until that is a major rollout of hydrogen-ready turbines. On the other hand, if you want to decarbonize gas-fired power, there's also some technological issues which you have to solve. And there are some promising technologies like the LM cycle, but that will also not go online on industrial scale before 2026. In addition, we could of course decarbonize coal-fired power. This is a terrible thought in Germany, but in principle you could do it, and this is a relative advanced technology, and but it runs into large political resistance. Next slide, please. On the next slide, I have tried to show what kind of interfaces and trade-offs you have between various grids. And I won't go through all of them, but just to pick an example is the question of gas and a CO2 grid, and also a hydrogen grid. You could imagine, so to speak, a conversion point of gas to hydrogen via steam reforming in the north of Germany, where the gas is landed, and where eventually you are also relatively close to exporting the carbon dioxide, which is a result of that. But then you would have to have a hydrogen grid all over Germany. You might eventually use the hydrogen storages up in the north, but this is not enough. As an alternative, you might just use the existing gas grid and have the transformation into hydrogen by steam reformers close to the customer. So you would only need a minimal local hydrogen grid, but you would need a relative large carbon dioxide collection system. So that is a certain trade-off, and then you would eventually not need storage, because the storage is provided by the gas system, which worked very well in the past. But you would have steam reformers with a load factor determined by heating, which is a load factor of 1,500 or 2,000 hours, which is a pretty lousy factor for such a high investment. So there are many issues to be discussed, and again, the first step that is on the policy level, but certainly the knowledge of regulators should be brought in order to prevent policymakers to jump over technology and economic issues. Next slide, please. Given that we have only 20 years left to 2045, then there should be a focus on early actions, and there should also a focus on robustness of the actions that we have to take. When we look on the carbon dioxide budget left, nature does not give us any credit line to overdraw that budget. I mean, when we overdraw it, then we also come into temperature increase above 1.5 degrees Celsius, eventually above 2 degrees Celsius, with the corresponding costly disasters. So in order to avoid these costly disasters, effectiveness is eventually more important than efficiency, because of the high cost to cover those disasters. Now, early actions could be that you do not look for consecutive testing out of any option, but you try to aim at the final status of any option, and you would also look at as much parallel approaches as you can, and not kind of waiting until one approach comes to its limits and then looking for the next approach. I mean, that means mainly that you have to start with carbon dioxide collection and with CCS now, and not wait until you become aware that renewables will not be rolled out fast enough, and that the technology to convert renewables into a reliable energy supply will not work fast enough. And when you look on the final designs, then you may also try to use upfront economies of scale, especially in pipelines. You have very large upfront economies of scale, so you should use them and not kind of build small systems and then try to increase them by intermediate compression or so. With the Carbon Protection Act, basically, it's clear that in Germany we all have to pay for being carbon neutral in 2045. So that means there's a secured market for decarbonized energy. And that means that basically also investment into upfront economies of scale is just a financing issue. I mean, when municipalities would invest into enlarging their district heating system and quite in a large scale way upfront, then it could be basically financed over the next 20 years, because in the very end you will save money because you have these economies of scale. And the same goes eventually for the elements of the system. And if kind of Germany would bring in its AAA credit rating, then I think there should be ways to create kind of funds out of which this investment could be financed and passed on to the municipalities. When it comes to robustness, certainly diversification of approaches is important. Also, the use of existing investment to the extent possible seems important to me, because then you don't run all the risks of all this permitting procedures and all the risks that things doesn't work. And so for many things, one should try to use existing investment. For example, if you would add decarbonization by mine scrubbing to coal-fired power plants, eventually to gas-fired power plants, that's something that you could add on. And the rest of the infrastructure, the power plants, the electricity, instruments, and all of that could be maintained, and then also the grid infrastructure of the electricity grid. So one should try really to use as much investment as possible, because it's so many things which have to play together to get to net zero in 2045, that one should not make it over complex. And another point is also one should try to keep it as regional as possible, because if you kind of involve a nationwide electricity system, then the stabilizing of that system is so complicated. And if something goes wrong, then it goes wrong for the whole nation, for the whole country. Whereas if you have it more on a regional level, then eventually you can contain it to one region. Last slide, please. So to conclude, I would like to quote something from Antoine de Saint-Exupéry. And what he says is concerning the future, it's not about predicting it, it's rather to make it possible. So it still is possible to reach net zero in 2045, but time is running out, and so we should try to have a really stringent approach to it, and to tackle everything now, and not wait for things to develop. Many thanks. And I'm happy to answer questions. My email address is on the cover page. So if you want to have a discussion and ask questions, then please send me an email. Many thanks.